To me, I read this and clear case of overly emotional landlord that took it way too personal. It probably got to a point where he was just appalled or shocked that the person wasn't paying him. And the logical next step would be, you're not going to get into the place if you're not going to pay me, which, as we know, it's definitely wrong.
Nothing will crush a real estate investor's spirit like landlord stress. The difference between being successful and miserable in managing properties is education. Welcome to Landlord University, where landlords learn. Landlord University is recorded from inside the RentPrep office, where Stephen White and Jeff Pearson share the lessons learned from working with some of the most successful landlords.
Welcome to Landlord University in the News. I'm Jeff Pearson. I'm here with my co-host, Stephen White. Hello, Stephen. How are you doing today?
Hey, pretty good, Jeff. Excited as always for an episode of In the News. We've got Jennifer with us today and had a chance to read the articles that she's picked out, and I'm pretty excited to jump in. So, Jennifer, what did you find for us this time?
Hi, everyone. Today's first article comes from Connecticut. On this police beat that I look at, it let me know that a Connecticut landlord was arrested a few weeks ago after he was accused of locking a tenant out of her apartment. He was actually charged with criminal lockout and criminal trespass. Apparently, he had entered the female tenant's apartment and locked her out. She filed a report, and this led to a warrant for his arrest. The landlord turned himself into the police after learning about this outstanding warrant. And I just thought this would be a good one to share. It's a really valuable lesson for landlords, no matter how frustrated they might be with the tenant, what not to do.
Yeah. I thought it was kind of interesting. It never really mentions in the article whether the landlord was really in the wrong. Like, I was expecting to see, he never gave 24-hour notice to enter the property if that was the case, or an eviction order was never issued, those type of things. It just goes right into the assumption that he did everything wrong. So it's tough to pick apart exactly what he did wrong, but we're assuming that he just went and swapped the locks out because the tenant wasn't paying. Is that right?
That's what I can assume from this. Yeah, I imagine that the police would, do their due diligence and
Yeah.
investigate. And if he was charged with it, just being arrested or pulled over or pulled aside and said, "Hey, what's going on?" But where he was charged with it, that leads me to think that it was, you know, pretty
Right.
much maybe in his error.
Right.
I think the biggest thing for us as landlords to pay attention to is the ultimate outcome is there was a warrant for his arrest. This is not something to play around with. When you rent a property to a tenant, that's their home. And you can't just come in and act as if you own it. You own the property, but they own the rights to that property, and you have to follow the process of the law, or you could get arrested.
Yeah. To me, I read this and clear case of overly emotional landlords, that took it way too personal. It probably got to a point where he was just appalled or shocked that the person wasn't paying him. And the logical, at least in his mind, next step would be, well, you're not going to get into the place if you're not going to pay me, type of a thing, which, as we know, whether you feel it's right or wrong, by the law, it's definitely wrong.
Yes, it is.
It's important for landlords just to remember that you cannot change the locks on an occupied property unless the sheriff is standing by you after they've, taken the property back after an eviction process, or you have determined by your state's rules that that property is abandoned and it meets the criteria for abandonment from a tenant. You can't ever go in and change those locks if somebody's there and you haven't gone through the proper procedures.
And in addition to that, you can't go into the property without permission, generally at least 24 hours prior notice. And
Right.
you can't touch their property unless you're following those processes of the law. Like you said, there needs to be a sheriff standing there in most cases when you've gone through the court process. That's what you're going to arrive at.
Yeah, again, I read this as a case that the landlord probably didn't do any of those things he was supposed to, I would imagine. If he locked her out, it says back in January, I got to imagine the steps, and even if he did do them, they weren't followed through, obviously. If he were to issue the notice of, to pay or leave, or the notice of eviction, or any of those things that would have given the tenant, opportunity or advanced notice. But yeah, you can't just lock them out, switch the locks out and say, well, if I'm not getting paid, you're not getting in.
No, it's not quite that simple.
Right, right. Yeah. Which again, I think a lot of landlords get themselves into trouble by using that sort of mentality, that logic. Well, it only seems right. Uh, I own the property. You're not paying me. You're not getting in. So there is a part of me that can understand it, or at least not not connect with it necessarily, but I understand the mentality of where they're coming from. But again, obviously not an educated landlord, I would say, who makes those type of mistakes and lets their emotions carry them away to do something like locking a tenant out.
Exactly.
Just can't do it.
Nope. Well, that's a nice, simple article, but it's very powerful. Definitely something for people to remember when they're dealing with their tenants. But Jennifer, let's move on to the next article.
Sure. This article talks about a Michigan bill that's working its way through the courts there. I'm sorry, through the legislature there, that would give landlords the ability to determine whether their tenants would be able to grow and or smoke marijuana in their rental properties. There are a lot of cities in the state of Michigan that have decriminalized marijuana use and possession. So right now, landlords don't really have much say in whether their tenants can do that or not in the property. This bill would allow landlords to restrict marijuana growing and use in rentals. A lot of people believe that this legislation isn't really necessary as it relates to smoking marijuana because landlords say whether tenants can smoke or not in their buildings. But they're finding that the important part of this bill is the need to control the growers in rentals because there can be a lot of problems associated with that. So I thought this was interesting that we could talk about it being a glimpse maybe for the future as marijuana legalization spreads, to different states.
Yeah, and what I found interesting about it, something that I had never really considered. I mean, all the marijuana issues aside, and it's definitely a topic that we get a lot of questions about here. Landlords that are in states that decriminalize it. We all agreed before we jumped on the recording that we really didn't have any idea that certain cities in Michigan were decriminalizing it. So it's clearly happening on a pretty wide scale. If you watch the news, it's going on all over the place. But I never really considered the problems with growing. And I love the one quote in here. It says, that they understand the need for this type of thing because there are bad growers out there. And, if you grow wrong, I guess it could lead to mold, damage, obviously, to the building, rooms that they're closing off, or, they got to irrigate or, water these things. So you got water damages. So you never really, I don't know, at least I never really thought of that kind of comes with the territory. What if they're not very good at growing their drugs? So then you got to deal with that. I mean, there probably is a pretty good science to it. I can't imagine it's like growing tomatoes outside in the garden. So if you're doing it in the house, you got to bring all that stuff inside. And of course, you got fire hazards if you're dealing with, lamps and lights and drop lights or whatever else they're using. So it's just interesting, kind of a different side that I hadn't really thought of before, the growing aspect of it too.
Yeah, I hadn't thought about that either. And when you think of it on a small scale, if somebody has a couple of plants, I don't think of that as being a significant problem. But when we think of marijuana growers, we're thinking of people who have plants, in an entire room or the garage or all of the rooms that they're not living in or using. And that certainly gets overboard pretty quick. So the damage that it can cause to the house is significant. The smoking part, well, let's touch on the smoking part first. They seem to think that that's not that big a deal because people can already regulate smoking cigarettes in their properties, in their rental properties. So why not be able to regulate marijuana smoking? I'm curious to see if the supporters of medical marijuana will be up in arms about this because for some conditions that people are taking marijuana, they feel that smoking is the only way that they can accomplish what they need to. Even the edible marijuana they're not able to keep foods down if they're not taking the marijuana, so therefore they need to have the opportunity to smoke it. And so that might be an ADA compliance type thing, although ADA is federal and the federal government doesn't recognize marijuana, so it probably wouldn't cross into that. But it's an interesting conundrum for the people who support medical marijuana as opposed to recreational marijuana users. I think there's no question that you can keep recreational medical marijuana users from using, but There's also not really a defined process for medical marijuana. I know here in California, if people want to get a medical marijuana card, it's not that difficult. You don't really have to have a particular illness or condition. You just need a doctor who says you've got aches and pains, and they'll be able to do it. So it would be simple for a tenant to say, "Oh, I've got a medical marijuana card, therefore I can still smoke it." So they've obviously said, "Nope, you have the right to tell your tenants that they can't smoke marijuana in your building." As far as they're growing, yeah, the potential damage is huge, and you don't hear too much about people just growing one or two plants. People tend to grow many, many plants, and so why not give landlords the opportunity to protect their property?
Yeah, it reminds me of a recent story here in Buffalo that I was watching on the news, where a guy converted his entire attic into a grow room, and they were saying that it was actually done pretty well. There wasn't any major issues, or at least that they didn't. That wasn't the focus of the story. But the guy had gotten caught because he was playing with fireworks, and the fireworks landed on the roof, and the fire department had to go up on the roof or something, and so they ended up discovering this. Um, so, but what the first image in my mind that I had was the the attic. This thing was covered in um, what looked like plastic covering. I mean, it looked like the guy put a lot of time into it. Went to the hardware store and bought everything you can imagine. These hanging lights, and like I said, some irrigation system. The guy had hoses running through the whole thing. So as a landlord, that's a lot of stuff happening in the unit. If people are stapling, plastic sheets up to try and contain odor or whatever the reason they're doing that for, and running hoses through the house and everything else. So I can almost see at some point if either A, they just say growing's not allowed no matter what, or maybe make them get like a permit or take a course in how to do it. Again,
Right.
I consider myself to not have a green thumb whatsoever. I kill just about every plant we ever try to get in the office or anything like that. So I don't think that it's as easy as just planting seeds and let them go. It's not like a ficus plant or something that grows pretty hardy. I think that there's a lot of maintenance and a lot of care. So obviously a lot can go wrong, and certainly damage to the property can follow. So I got to imagine that sooner or later there's going to be legislation regarding the growing too, is kind of something that I'm getting from the article as well.
I agree.
Yeah, so definitely interesting to see how this sort of all plays out, and it's in the news all the time. And I've heard a lot of people compare this sort of to the age of prohibition, where eventually it's going to get decriminalized, and who knows, maybe as a society they'll look at things differently. And I don't know. I still feel in a lot of ways we're a far way away from that.
I think society is still figuring it out, and it'll be interesting to see where it all goes. The big thing is when you have communities like this that are willing to create legislation that protects landlords in their property. That's important because we have to have the ability to regulate what happens on our property that has the potential for damaging the property. And
Right.
this is a good step in the right direction.
Yeah, and I hate to stereotype or profile anybody, but that story coming out of Buffalo is a pretty good story. Whether you agree with the marijuana use, recreational, medical, whatever, there seems to be a track record of just sort of stupid decisions being made. Like this guy who's playing with fireworks in January or February, whenever it was. Fireworks are illegal in New York, so you know why bring that sort of attention to yourself? I think that there's just sort of this automatic association that people who are involved in that lifestyle maybe don't make the best decisions, and I think that that's something that scares a lot of landlords away from considering tenants who are open about it, or who say, hey, I do it, but I'm responsible. We get that question a lot here at RentPrep, where a landlord will say, this tenant was open with me. They said that they do it, for medical reasons, but I'm just still not comfortable. So, I think it's going to be interesting to see what time does to our perceptions, and eventually what's going to come of all this.
Yes, very true.
Yeah.
Well, thank you very much, Stephen and Jennifer. I look forward to talking with you both next week.
Thanks, guys.
Thanks for listening to Landlord University, and remember to visit rentprep.com/landlordu to see show notes and access free resources like forms and guides. And be sure to check out Jeff Pearson hosting his own hit podcast at thementorimpact.com.